People always tell you that motherhood changes everything, but no one warned me how quickly it could turn into a battlefield. In the weeks after my daughter Lily was born, I felt like my body was held together by threads, yet my heart had never been fuller. Every tiny sound she made pulled me closer, grounding me even when I felt dizzy from exhaustion. Mark, my husband, seemed proud at first, but his smile soon began to fade in ways I couldn't understand. The warmth I expected from him slipped into cold critiques, leaving me confused and ashamed every time he questioned whether I was handling things the way a real mother should. At first, I tried to brush it off as normal new parent stress, but the tension in the house settled like a permanent fog. Mark started analyzing everything I did with Lily, from how long I nursed her to how I rocked her at night, as if he were grading me on some secret rubric I didn't know existed. His tone shifted into something clipped, almost impatient, whenever I asked for help or admitted I was overwhelmed. What hurt most was how he began praising his sister Sabrina for every minor thing she did during her visits, while treating my efforts like they were barely adequate. I told myself I was imagining the way they exchanged glances, but deep down I felt something slipping out of my grasp, something I couldn't yet name. Sabrina had always been opinionated, but after Lily's birth she seemed to crown herself an authority on motherhood, despite never having children of her own. She floated around my house like she owned it, touching things without asking, rearranging baby supplies, and commenting on every little detail as if she were compiling a report. Her perfume, sharp and floral, lingered in every room after she left, irritating my senses long after her criticism had settled in my bones. Mark encouraged her involvement, often saying things like she's just trying to help while ignoring how drained I felt after every visit. I hated the way Sabrina looked at me sometimes, like I was a temporary placeholder instead of Lily's mother. The nights were the hardest, because that was when my mind unraveled with questions that gnawed at my confidence. Lily's soft cries echoed through the dim hallway, and I would cradle her against my chest, breathing in the sweet milk scent of her hair while fighting the exhaustion that blurred my vision. I kept wondering why Mark refused to acknowledge how hard I was trying, or why he seemed determined to highlight every imperfection. Sometimes he stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher, part annoyance, part something colder. When I asked him if everything was okay between us, he brushed me off with a sigh, saying I was too sensitive lately. As if my emotions were inconveniences rather than warnings, he refused to hear. It didn't help that my body felt foreign to me, still healing and aching in unpredictable ways that made me hyper-aware of every flaw. I tried explaining to Mark that I needed reassurance, support, something to remind me that I wasn't failing at the one thing that mattered most to me. Instead, he told me that Sabrina had offered to step in more, as if her presence was some sort of gift, rather than a reminder that he doubted me. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest every time he mentioned her, a quiet panic that whispered he was comparing us. My stomach tightened whenever I caught Sabrina scanning me with that triumphant smirk, like she already believed she knew how this story would end. But things were about to get much worse. The turning point came one quiet afternoon when Lily slept peacefully in her bassinet and I finally felt a momentary calm wash over me. I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water and heard voices drifting from the living room, Mark and Sabrina, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. I froze behind the wall, my pulse thudding in my ears as I listened to them discussing me like I wasn't even human. Sabrina whispered something about stability and proper guardianship, and Mark sighed in a way that made my stomach drop, as if he were burdened with decisions he never intended to share with me. My hands trembled as I pressed myself flatter against the wall, afraid any movement would expose that I was listening. Mark's voice grew lower as he said something about documents and timing, and Sabrina replied with a confidence that made my skin crawl. They spoke about my postpartum anxiety like it was a flaw they could exploit, a weakness that conveniently lined up with whatever plan they were crafting. I felt the room tilt as betrayals seeped through me, heavier than anything I had carried since giving birth. Every instinct screamed at me to run in there and demand answers, but fear pinned me in place, anchoring me to the awful realization that something was slipping out of my control. When their conversation ended, I darted back to the nursery and sat beside Lily, my breath shaking as I tried to make sense of what I had heard. I reached into her drawer to grab a spare blanket, needing something familiar to ground myself, and that's when I noticed an envelope tucked beneath her folded clothes. It wasn't mine, and the handwriting on it wasn't Mark's either, which sent a cold ripple through me. I opened it with trembling fingers, and found inside a printed email thread between Mark and someone named Attorney Caldwell, discussing an upcoming meeting about guardianship, paperwork, and the mother's compromised capacity. My vision blurred as I stared at the words. my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. That was the moment I realized Mark wasn't questioning my capability. He was preparing to take my daughter from me. The email thread haunted me for days, replaying in my mind every time I looked at Lily's sleeping face. I kept seeing those words, compromised capacity, as if someone had branded them onto my skin. Mark acted completely normal, going through his routines with practiced ease, while I struggled to keep my breathing steady around him. Every time he touched Lily, even gently, my stomach clenched with panic, because now I knew what he was capable of. I felt like I was living with a stranger wearing my husband's face, someone who believed he had the right to decide whether I was worthy of motherhood. The tension began to show in small, insidious ways that made me question how long this plan had been brewing. Mark started correcting me in front of Sabrina more openly, making passive-aggressive remarks about my forgetfulness or emotional instability. He hovered whenever I changed Lily's diaper or fed her, pointing out microscopic things I supposedly did wrong. Sabrina, emboldened by his behavior, took on an air of ownership around Lily, cradling her like she was already hers. The worst part was the smug pity in her smile whenever she glanced my way, as if she already saw me fading out of the picture. I felt trapped, surrounded by people who were trying to rewrite my reality. I tried to keep a calm exterior, but inside my fear swirled with a rising anger that burned hotter each day. Late at night, when Lily slept against my chest, I replayed every conversation from the weeks before, realizing the signs had been there all along. Mark had been documenting my exhaustion, my tears, my occasional moments of overwhelm, twisting them into evidence for his narrative. Even the day he encouraged me to rest while Sabrina watched Lily suddenly made sense. He had been testing boundaries, seeing how easily I could be replaced. The more I pieced together, the more my grief hardened into a determination I hadn't known I possessed. But things were about to get much worse. A few mornings later, I walked into the nursery and found Sabrina rearranging Lily's clothes without asking, as if she were setting up her own space. She was humming softly while folding tiny onesies, her back turned to me in a way that made my blood run cold. When she finally noticed me, she acted startled, placing a hand dramatically over her chest before smiling with that syrupy condescension. She said she was only helping, but her tone made it clear she believed she had authority to do whatever she wanted. Something in me snapped, and I told her to stop touching my daughter's things, but she only tilted her head and said, "Alina, maybe this isn't the best time for emotional outbursts." Her words felt like a slap, mostly because they were so eerily aligned with the language from the email I'd found. Mark entered the room moments later, drawn by the raised voices, and instead of supporting me, he scolded me like a misbehaving child. He pulled Sabrina protectively to his side, glaring at me as though I were the unstable one. I felt a hot rush of humiliation that made my eyes burn, but I forced myself to stay silent, terrified of giving them more ammunition. Later that day, I heard them whispering again, my name floating through their conversation like a diagnosis neither of them believed. I could hear. The atmosphere in the house grew suffocating, especially as Sabrina's involvement escalated into invasive territory. She began bringing over bags of baby supplies bottles, diapers, clothing items, suspiciously identical to what I used for Lily. When I asked why, she explained that it was always good to have duplicates in case of emergencies, though she never clarified what kind of emergencies she was preparing for. Mark echoed her reasoning with an unsettling casualness, brushing off my concerns as paranoia. Every new item she laid out on the guest room bed made my skin crawl, because it felt like she was building a nursery for a child who wasn't hers. I started checking Lily's things every night, terrified something would go missing. My suspicion deepened when I noticed Mark lying about his whereabouts more frequently. He'd claim he was running errands or picking up groceries, but the receipts I found in his pockets didn't match his explanations. One afternoon, I tracked his location through our shared phone plan and saw he had spent over an hour near a law office across town. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the chest, leaving me breathless as I stared at the tiny blue dot on the screen. When he returned home, he kissed Lily on the forehead like nothing had happened, ignoring the way my hands shook as I held her close. I realized he wasn't just planning something, he was accelerating. I knew I needed proof, something undeniable, something I could hold in my hands. So the next time Mark left his laptop unattended, I forced myself to overcome the guilt and opened it with trembling fingers. The screen led up to an email inbox, full of flagged messages discussing next steps, psychological assessment, and viable transfer timeline. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I thought the sound alone might give me away. I clicked through thread after thread, reading each sentence in stunned horror as I realized how deep their scheme ran. The language was clinical, calculated, and disturbingly confident. But the worst discovery was still waiting for me. Hidden in a folder labeled Sabrina Important, I found a string of texts he had backed up from his phone. Messages between the two of them discussing me in ways that made bile rise in my throat. They called me unfit, too emotionally volatile, and a risk to Lily's development. Sabrina wrote, "She won't fight it. She's too fragile." And Mark replied, "She'll thank us eventually." My vision blurred as I scrolled through every smug, condescending word, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped the laptop. And that was when I realized this wasn't just betrayal, it was a coordinated attempt to erase me. I had always believed betrayal came with warning signs, raised voices, suspicious behavior, cracks in the relationship that you could trace back with hindsight. But what I discovered on Mark's laptop wasn't a crack. It was a chasm he had quietly built beneath my feet, waiting for the right moment to watch me fall through. That night, after reading those messages, I lay on the floor of the nursery with Lily sleeping against my chest, my tears soaking into her blanket. Every breath felt like dragging glass into my lungs, because the man I trusted most had turned me into a target in my own home. And the worst part was realizing how carefully, how deliberately, he had planned to rip my child away from me. The next morning, I woke with a dull ache behind my eyes, the kind that comes from crying until your body can't produce another tear. I moved through the house like a ghost, noticing every small detail I had missed before: the way Sabrina kept a spare car seat in her trunk, the way Mark glanced at Lily with a calculating expression instead of tenderness, the way they always seemed to pause their conversations when I walked into the room. A faint buzzing filled my ears as the truth became clearer with each passing hour. They weren't preparing for some distant possibility. They were preparing for an imminent transfer of guardianship. And they expected me to crumble quietly. I needed answers, real ones, not the lies Mark fed me with polite indifference. So when he left for another meeting, I gathered my courage and searched more thoroughly. His office smelled faintly of cedar and ink, and the air felt thick with secrets he thought I'd never uncover. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath stacks of receipts and old utility bills, I found a large manila envelope stamped with the name of the same attorney from the emails. My stomach twisted as I opened it and pulled out the thick stack of papers inside. The first page alone made my mouth go dry. Petition for temporary guardianship, minor child, Lillian Carter. My hands shook so violently that the pages ruffled like wings. But I forced myself to keep reading. The petition accused me of psychological instability, postpartum delusions, erratic behavior, and emotional volatility, all carefully framed in a way that made me sound like a danger to my own daughter. The worst part was how professional it all looked, with attached notes from a supposed family advocate I had never even met. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized Mark had crafted an entire false narrative, one that would have looked legitimate to any legal authority. The room tilted around me, and I had to brace myself against the desk just to stay upright. But things were about to get worse. Stuck between the pages was a personal letter written by Mark, addressed to the attorney, explaining additional concerns about my fitness as a mother. He described moments of postpartum exhaustion as disorientation, my rare frustrated tears as emotional breakdowns, and my hesitation to let Sabrina take over tasks as irrational possessiveness. He even documented fabricated incidents, claiming I had once fallen asleep while holding Lily in a dangerous position, something that had never happened. Reading his lies felt like drowning in ice water, every sentence a new weight dragging me deeper. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't frustration. This was sabotage by design. When I reached the final pages, I found documents outlining the next steps they planned to take, including a recommended date for the guardianship hearing. They had chosen a day 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks until my daughter could be ripped from my arms and handed to a woman who smirked at me like she'd already won. For the first time since Lily was born, fear gave way to something sharper, something fierce and protective. They thought I was fragile, unstable, easy to manipulate. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I knew I needed help, but I couldn't just walk into a law office with no preparation, especially not with Mark monitoring my every move. So I turned to the only person I could trust, a former coworker named Jenna, someone I hadn't spoken to in months, but who had always been fiercely loyal. When I called her, my voice shook so badly I could barely get the words out. She heard the panic in my tone and immediately left work to meet me at a small cafe, where we could talk without risk of Mark overhearing. When I showed her the documents, her eyes widened with disbelief before hardening with anger. "Alina, this is illegal and evil," she said, gripping my hand so tightly it grounded me. She helped me map out the first steps, find a lawyer discreetly, gather evidence, document everything Mark and Sabrina had said or done, And most importantly, keep Lily close at all times. Jenna also suggested I speak to a therapist immediately to counter their claims of instability with professional records. It was overwhelming, terrifying even, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of control return to me. Someone believed me. Someone was on my side. That night, back in my house, I moved with a quiet determination, noting every detail that could help me later. Mark returned late, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and stale office air. And when he kissed Lily's forehead, the sight made something twist painfully inside me. He had no idea. I knew everything. He had no idea I was already building a case of my own. I watched him from across the room, careful not to reveal the tremor of fear and rage beneath my calm expression. He smiled at me with that fake warmth he'd perfected, and I smiled back just enough to keep him unaware. But I couldn't stop thinking about Sabrina, about how deeply she was rooted in all of this. Something told me the guardianship plan wasn't the whole story, and I was right. The next day, while Mark showered, I searched through a folder in his nightstand labeled Business. I expected financial statements, maybe debt notices, but what I found instead made my breath catch in my throat. There were signed contracts showing large sums of money transferred from Sabrina to Mark months before Lily was born. Attached to one receipt was a handwritten note in Sabrina's unmistakably looping handwriting. "Just remember our agreement." My heart dropped. My skin tingled with dread. I read the note again, slower this time, letting the implication sink in. This wasn't just about guardianship. This wasn't about concern for Lily. This was a transaction. Sabrina couldn't have children. Mark needed money. He promised her my baby. That was the moment everything changed. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a second. My mind raced with every horrifying implication of what I had discovered. Each thought tangled with fear and rage until I felt like my chest might cave in. Mark had sold our daughter before she was even born, treating her like a bargaining chip instead of a human life. And he had done it with the full support of the woman who pretended to be my sister. Every time Lily stirred beside me, my arms tightened around her protectively, as if someone were already reaching to pull her away. I knew I couldn't confront them yet, not without a plan. Not without a shield strong enough to withstand the storm I knew was coming. The first step was securing legal protection. So early the next morning, I met with an attorney recommended by Jenna. The office smelled faintly of paper and coffee, comforting in its sterility, a stark contrast to the chaos consuming my life. The lawyer, Ms. Aldridge, listened intently as I explained. Everything from the hidden emails to the manipulated documents, to the money I discovered Sabrina had given Mark. Her expression shifted gradually from concern to simmering outrage, her pen moving quickly across her notepad as she gathered details. When I showed her the guardianship petition, she let out a low, controlled breath and told me I had more evidence on my side than most mothers ever did in situations like this. Hearing that gave me a flicker of hope, even though a knot of dread remained anchored in my stomach. Next, she insisted I see a licensed therapist immediately, someone who could begin documenting my mental and emotional stability in ways that would unequivocally defend me against their fabricated claims. I spent an hour spilling everything to the therapist, my fears, my exhaustion, the gaslighting, the manipulation, and she assured me I was experiencing normal postpartum challenges, not instability. The validation nearly broke me open, and I left her office with a signed letter confirming my mental health was intact. I clutched that letter like a lifeline, knowing it could be the difference between motherhood and unthinkable loss. But even with these first steps completed, I knew I had to tread carefully at home until I gathered every shred of evidence needed to dismantle their plan. When I returned, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that prickles at your nerves. Mark and Sabrina were in the living room, whispering in low tones that stopped abruptly the moment I walked in. Sabrina's smile was too bright, too rehearsed, and Mark regarded me with that unsettling mixture of detachment and calculation. I felt their eyes track my every movement as I picked Lily up from her bassinet, my fingers brushing over the soft curls on her tiny head. The weight of what they intended to do pressed heavily on my skin, but I forced myself to stay composed, because panicking now would only feed the story they were trying to tell. Instead, I acted as though nothing had changed, even though everything inside me had shifted violently. But things were about to get much worse. 2 days later, Mark announced casually, as if discussing weekend plans, that he had scheduled a family meeting with a mediator to discuss my behavioral concerns. He framed it like a kindness, reminding me that Sabrina and he were worried about me and wanted to support my transition into motherhood. My blood boiled at his manipulation, the way he twisted my suffering into an accusation, but I couldn't lash out. I nodded quietly, pretending to accept it. all while secretly texting Ms. Aldridge to let her know the confrontation was coming sooner than expected. She responded quickly, "Record everything. Do not go alone." That evening, the air in our house felt charged, heavy with anticipation and unspoken hostility. Mark hovered around me, watching me as if waiting for some slip-up he could document. Sabrina stayed late, conveniently offering to give me a break by holding Lily while giving me that infuriatingly smug expression again. I refused her every time, keeping Lily close enough to hear her steady breathing. Inside, my nerves tightened like wire, because I knew the moment was coming when I would have to expose them both. I just needed the right timing, the right impact, the right blow to crush their scheme completely. The day of the mediation arrived far too quickly. It was held in a neutral office space downtown, the kind designed to make people feel calm even as their lives fractured. Mark walked in confidently, Sabrina beside him like a second shadow, while I entered with Ms. Aldridge at my side. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, but I kept my head high, clutching Lily close as she slept peacefully against my chest. The mediator began with pleasantries, but Mark wasted no time launching into a rehearsed speech about my emotional unpredictability and concerning behaviors. His voice was steady, almost sympathetic, like he was a noble husband trying to save his child from a fragile mother. And then it was my turn. I reached into my bag and laid everything on the table like a hand of cards. I'd been waiting to play transcripts of their messages, the guardianship petition, the therapist's written assessment, screenshots of Mark's emails with the attorney, and copies of the financial documents tying Sabrina's money to Mark's hidden agreement. The color drained from both their faces so quickly it was almost satisfying, like watching masks get ripped away in real time. The mediator looked stunned, flipping through the documents with growing disbelief as the truth unfolded. Mark stammered out excuses. Sabrina burst into indignant protests. But nothing they said could cover the sheer amount of evidence stacked against them. And then, with a calm I didn't even recognize in myself, I hit them with the final piece I had found buried in Mark's financial folder. A single-sentence paragraph. He had committed fraud using Sabrina's identity. The room erupted. Mark's face went gray as he realized what I knew, and Sabrina turned on him with a fury I had never seen from her before. They argued over each other, their alliance dissolving instantly as panic overtook their practiced confidence. The mediator immediately advised we suspend the meeting due to significant legal implications, and Ms. Aldridge used that moment to escort me out while Mark was still shouting. As I stepped into the hallway, Lily still sleeping peacefully against me, a strange calm washed over my trembling body. This wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, they weren't the ones in control anymore, and they knew it. I didn't realize how quickly everything would spiral once the truth was out in the open. The moment Ms. Aldridge and I left that mediation room, I felt the atmosphere around us shift as though the balance of power I had been clinging to by my fingertips suddenly, miraculously, tipped in my favor. But with that shift came a new wave of fear, because exposing Mark and Sabrina was only the beginning. They were cornered animals now, unpredictable and dangerous, and I knew they wouldn't give up. Still, as I held Lily close on the drive home, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. The faint, fragile pulse of hope beating under my ribs, insisting I wasn't as powerless as they believed. The next morning, everything erupted. I woke to the sharp pounding of fists against my front door, the frantic rhythm instantly setting my heart racing. When I opened it, a crack. Sabrina stood there, eyes swollen and wild, her hair disheveled, screaming accusations before the door even fully opened. She insisted I had misinterpreted their intentions, that Mark had only been exploring options, and that the money she gave him had nothing to do with Lily. Her voice broke as she tried to plead her case, but all I could see was the woman who had been preparing to take my baby, my entire world, while smiling in my face. I closed the door on her cries, my hands shaking, but not from guilt. For the first time, my trembling came from rage I no longer felt afraid to own. Mark's downfall came more swiftly than I expected. Within 2 days, Ms. Aldridge had forwarded all evidence of fraudulent activity to the appropriate authorities. And while it would take time for the legal process to unfold, the consequences for him and Sabrina were already building like a storm cloud. I heard him pacing in the kitchen that night, the frantic shuffle of his steps betraying his collapsing composure. When he finally approached me, his voice cracked with desperation, something I had never heard from him before. He begged me to reconsider, to slow down, to think of our family, as though he hadn't spent months scheming to rip that family apart. His remorse felt thin, superficial, a flimsy mask stretched across a truth he could no longer hide. But he only grew more frantic when he realized I wasn't bending, not even an inch. He raised his voice, tried to twist the narrative again, insisting I had forced him into bad decisions with my emotional neglect. The words barely registered. I simply stood there, holding Lily on my hip, feeling her tiny fingers curl around my shirt as if grounding me. The sight of her soft, peaceful face, juxtaposed with Mark's frantic unraveling, crystallized something inside me. There was no version of this marriage that could be salvaged, no trust left to rebuild. He had eaten away at the foundation of our life until there was nothing solid left beneath me. And for the first time, I felt absolutely no fear of walking away. But things were about to get even more definitive. The following week, I filed for full legal custody, temporary protective orders, and separation, all with Ms. Aldridge's guidance and unwavering confidence in my case. The mountain of evidence I had accumulated painted a picture so damning that even Mark's own lawyer recommended he comply with all custody restrictions to avoid further legal consequences. Sabrina's involvement made everything worse for them. Her financial entanglement and participation in the scheme weakened Mark's defensive position beyond repair. And when law enforcement began their initial inquiry into the fraudulent documents, the panic in Mark's eyes told me he finally understood that his choices were not only immoral but criminal. He had no more moves left. The day the temporary custody ruling was issued, I felt a surreal calm settle over me, a silence in my mind where panic once lived. Standing in that courtroom, holding Lily against my chest while Mark avoided my eyes, I felt as though I had stepped outside my own body. The judge's words were steady, decisive, and protective in a way I had been longing for since this nightmare began. When he declared that I was to have primary custody and that Mark's visitation would be supervised pending further investigation, my knees nearly buckled. Relief flooded me so suddenly, so overwhelmingly, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. It was the first real taste of safety I'd had in months. After the ruling, I packed Lily's things and left the house for good. I moved into a small apartment near Jenna, who helped me settle in with groceries, warm blankets, and the kind of gentle reassurance I hadn't realized I'd been starving for. The space was modest, quiet, and sunlit in the afternoons, the kind of place that felt like a sanctuary in ways my marital home never had. Each night, I watched Lily sleep in her bassinet beside my bed, her little breaths steady and unharmed. And I felt a guilt-ridden gratitude that she would never remember the chaos she was born into. I whispered promises to her in the dark, vowing that she would grow up surrounded by love, not schemes or betrayal. In the months that followed, the legal proceedings continued unfolding in a direction neither Mark nor Sabrina could escape. Their fraudulent activities came fully to light: fake signatures, forged identification documents, and misappropriated funds tied directly to Sabrina's finances. Mark lost his job, his reputation, and eventually his freedom, facing charges that carried enough weight to ensure he wouldn't be able to disrupt our lives for a very long time. Sabrina faced her own consequences. Her involvement, undeniable and meticulously documented. They had built their entire scheme on lies. But it was the truth, cold, undeniable, irrefutable, that buried them both. When the final rulings came in and I was granted full, permanent custody, I held Lily in my arms and cried in a way I never had before. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from a profound, bone-deep relief that washed away the last remnants of the nightmare I had survived. Standing by the window, watching sunlight spill across the floor, I realized I felt something I had been missing for a long, long time. Freedom. Not just from Mark, not just from Sabrina, but from the doubt they had planted so carefully in me. And for the first time, I could finally breathe.